Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're going to be looking at Existential Inertia Defended, Part 2. So I am going to be streamlining a bit, mainly because, well, my last video was quite long, and secondly, I am immensely busy because it's midterm season. My aim, however, is to preserve the quality of my content as usual, but provide less detail than usual. So before getting into the video, it's important to, remind you guys of the relevant background at play. So first thing that I would recommend is my video Existential Inertia, a User's Guide, and then of course the Intellectual Conservatism video, to which I am responding, entitled Confronting Existential Inertia, and then my video, my Part 1 in response to that, Existential Inertia Defended Part 1, and then finally Existential Inertia and the Aristotelian Proof, that article in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion. I will have all four of these relevant pieces of background in the description, so you can check that. So as I said, we're probably going to be streamlining a bit, and hence may seem a little bit rushed, but we're going to have fun nonetheless. So Christopher's first criticism of existential inertia derives from the Summa Theologiae Prima Pars, question 104, article 1. The argument says that whatever is F by participation depends for its F-ness at any moment at which it exists on what is F essentially. So for instance, if we were to think of a kind of Platonic view of reality, well, whatever is white by participation depends for its whiteness on the Platonic form of whiteness, because it's sort of instantiating that and participating it and exemplifying it at any moment at which it exists. Now, of course, Christopher isn't taking a Platonic account, but he offered that as a kind of a nice illustration of really what this premise is getting at. And then the second premise says, well, that in which essence and existence are distinct has existence by participation, in which case it would follow from those two that whatever has an essence-existence distinction depends at any moment at which it exists on what exists essentially. That is to say, existence itself, namely God. So broadly, here are three responses. The first response is that, well, as Christopher himself recognizes, the argument that he provides assumes a Thomistic account of existence and essence, something that basically no inertialist would grant. And recall the example from my previous Part 1 Existential Inertia video of Plantinga and the Doctrine of Divine Simplicity, right? So Plantinga's criticism of the Doctrine of Divine Simplicity went something along the lines of, well, according to the Doctrine of Divine Simplicity, God is identical to all of his properties, in which case God would be identical to something that's abstract, because properties are abstract according to Plantinga, in which case God would be causally effete. That is to say, he wouldn't have any causal power. He'd be an abstract object, which is absurd. Then he couldn't create the universe. Now, I think Thomists rightly reject this argument because it foists upon them a foreign metaphysical framework, namely a kind of Plantingian analytic Platonic account of properties, something that the proponents of the Doctrine of Divine Simplicity are well within their epistemic rights of rejecting. And I think that, if that move is dialectically effective there, which I think it is, then it's also dialectically effective here with respect to other accounts of existence and essence. So that's basically the first response, is that the inertialist would simply not grant that this is a kind of legitimate dialectical move. Now, it is a valuable argument that he's making, and it's valuable to draw out certain commitments of different systems, but as for its dialectical efficacy against someone who supports or accepts or is even agnostic on existential inertia, it's probably going to be quite dialectically limited. As for the second response, it seems plausible to me that there are other coherent accounts that don't involve things as participating in something else that has existence essentially. So here's one account that I think is at least coherent. I'm not saying I adopt it, I'm not saying I don't adopt it. I just think it's at least coherent and somewhat seemingly plausible. Okay, so among the properties that a thing has, right, there are its essential properties. And basically, essential properties are intrinsic properties that a thing has, but which it could not exist without. More carefully, we might put it as, for any x and for any f, f is an essential property of x, if and only if, 1, necessarily, if x exists, then x is f. That is to say that x couldn't exist without f, right? And 2, X is intrinsically F. And of course this raises the question, well, what do we mean by intrinsic? Well, X is intrinsically F if and only if X is F, and the specification of X as being F doesn't advert or adduce or make reference to things that are not within X. So intrinsic properties are essentially things that substances or entities have in and of themselves, in the way that they themselves are, without reference to their environment or things that are outside of them, as it were. It's just a rough sketch. And so on this account, it just follows that existence is an essential property of everything. Why? Because it meets the right-hand side of that biconditional for something's being an essential property. So recall that the right-hand side of that biconditional said necessarily, if X exists, then X is F, and 2, X is intrinsically F. Those are two that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient, according to this account, of something's being an essential property of X. Now, clearly existence satisfies both of them. Of course, necessarily, if X exists, then X exists, right? Like, that's quite obviously true. Something, in any world in which X exists, well, X exists. In which case, X can't exist without its existence, right? And so, although it might sound complicated, it does satisfy that first individually necessary condition for something's being an essential property. And secondly, it does satisfy the intrinsicality condition, because the existence of X is not something that is like completely outside of or completely in the environment of X. No, we're characterizing X as it is in itself, namely X exists. We're not adducing or specifying something apart from X. Under this account, it just follows that existence is an essential property of things. Moreover, on this account, it's also plainly true that the view about essence and existence doesn't entail that everything necessarily exists. Like those things whose essence contains existence, but not necessary existence, exist in a merely contingent way. And by contrast, those things whose essence contains necessary existence exist in a necessary way. And so on this particular articulation of this view, it's not true that because the existence of a thing is one among its essential properties, the thing exists because of this fact, and so exists of necessity. And so on this account, moreover, it's not true that things in which essence and existence are distinct don't have existence essentially. According to this account, everything has existence essentially because everything is such that existence is an intrinsic property that it couldn't exist without. Under this account, it's not going to be the case that things participate in something else that has existence essentially for their having existence. No, everything exists essentially. Now, of course, whether or not this account is true or defensible is not what I'm discussing here, right? I'm just articulating one account that some people might give that doesn't involve things as participating in something else that has existence essentially. And then the third and final response is that, well, plausibly, premise 2's truth isn't established even if we grant some kind of essence-existence distinction. Now recall premise 2. It says that that in which essence and existence are distinct has existence by participation. Now, arguably, this is only going to be true on very specific construals of essence and existence, and won't be established by the mere fact of S's having an essence distinct from or not identical with its existence, right? I mean, an argument needs to be given as to why the mere fact of S's having an essence that is not identical with S's existence, why that mere fact would entail that S exists by participation. And that was an argument that wasn't provided in the discussion. And granted, as they said, we'd have to take like 30 hours to dig into the underlying metaphysics. But it is worth pointing out that the mere fact of having an essence-existence distinction wouldn't entail that something exists by participation. Here's one way we might come to appreciate that. Imagine the astronauts on the International Space Station, right? When they take a cup and they let it go, they notice that without anything kind of holding it there, the cup just retains its spatial location. But nevertheless, the cup's spatial location is distinct from the cup itself and the cup's essence, right? And so we have an essence spatial location distinction, as it were. But still, it's not the case that this this thing needs some sort of sustaining cause in terms of its participating in something else at any moment at which it exists. No, it just simply retains its spatial location as a form of stasis or unchangingness, as a kind of condition or state of actuality, without some sort of concurrent keeper or holder of its being in that spatial location. And so what this tells us is that even if it's the case that something is distinct from something's existence, it wouldn't follow that the thing only has that by participating in the sustaining causal power of something else, right? Again, precisely because the spatial location of the cup is distinct from the essence of the cup. I mean, clearly the cup can exist without being in that spatial location, but yet it doesn't require that kind of sustaining cause in which it participates for the relevant causal power. I'm not claiming that existence does in fact behave in the manner that, for instance, spatial location behaves. Rather, I'm simply offering an undercutting defeater, right? I'm not saying that it is in fact the case that existence behaves in this manner, right? Because that would be to beg the question. I mean, that would literally just be me insisting that existence behaves inertially. Rather, I'm giving an undercutting defeater, showing that even if we grant that there's a non-numerical identity relation between essence and existence in the things of our experience, it wouldn't thereby follow that the thing has existence by participation in some sort of sustaining ground. Now, recall that I was saying that an argument needs to be given as to why the mere fact of this non-identity between essence and existence entails that the thing exists by participation in some sort of sustaining cause or ground of being, right? And that was not provided in the discussion. Now, Feser himself does attempt to provide such an argument, but by my lights, at least, his arguments do not work. And so, basically, I'm going to take us through some of the things that Feser says in his Thomistic proof that argues from the fact of the distinction between essence and existence to the need of a sustaining cause or ground in which the thing participates for its being or existence. So, Feser on pages 124 and 125 of his 5 proofs, the first argument that he levels is that existence cannot follow or flow from the essence of an essence-existence composite, and nor can the essence-existence composite impart existence to itself, of course, for that would amount to self-causation. There must then exist some extrinsic cause that imparts existence to an essence-existence composite. As Feser recognizes, however, this reasoning is incomplete, right? For even if successful, it does not entail the need for a concurrent existential sustaining cause of essence-existence composites at non-first moments of their existence. That is to say, after they have already been brought into existence. And now Feser recognizes this, and he does attempt to solve it, right? And so Feser argues that the line of reasoning applies to a thing not only before it comes into being and as it comes into being, but always, even after it has come into being. End quote. That's on page 126. And then Feser continues, writing that Phaedo's existence is distinct from Phaedo's essence, does not follow from Phaedo's essence, and cannot be imparted by Phaedo to his essence. All of these things are true not only before Phaedo exists and at the time he is conceived, but also after he comes into being, and indeed at every moment he is alive. Phaedo's existence here and now is distinct from his essence, and does not follow from his essence. So, here and now, there must be some cause that adds or imparts existence to that essence. Otherwise, Phaedo would not exist here and now any more than he did before he was conceived. He would, quote-unquote, blink out of existence or be annihilated. That's on page 126. Now, I think the principal problem with this is that it simply doesn't justify the requirement of a concurrent sustaining cause. Right? I mean, even if S's existence at t is distinct from S's essence at t, such that neither S at t nor S's essence at t could account for or explain S's existence at t, it simply doesn't follow that the only remaining option for explaining S's existence at t is a concurrent sustaining cause which imparts existence to S at t. But that, of course, is precisely what Feser needs for his argument to succeed. And in fact, we do seem to have, perfectly legitimate alternative explanations of S's existence at t that decidedly don't involve adducing or appealing to efficient sustaining causes, right? So, for instance, S's existence at t could easily be explained, for all Feser's argument shows, by the state and existence of S immediately prior to t in conjunction with there being no sufficiently destructive factors operative, or perhaps by the very nature of persistent existence as the maintenance or non-disruption of a state of unchanging actuality, So that kind of that explanation would treat existence as the kind of spatial location that I was mentioning earlier. Or alternatively, the explanation could be had in virtue of the metaphysical necessity of persistence in the absence of sufficient destructive factors, and so on, right? Fazer, in his attempts to prove that the mere fact of distinction entails that S exists by participation, right? In his attempts to prove that, he gives no reason to rule out any of these alternative explanations, and hence these alternative explanations would serve as a kind of undercutting defeater for what he is arguing. So that was just a little tangent. I just wanted to emphasize that we need some sort of positive argument as to why the mere fact of the essence-existence distinction would entail that S exists by participation, a kind of concurrent participation in another. And I just wanted to evaluate one potential way to make that inference and show by my lights how it does not work. So then Gill gives an epistemological argument for the essence-existence distinction. Essentially, we can grasp what a thing is, or its essence, without thereby knowing that it exists, or grasping whether or not it exists. And so the two things that I would say in response is that, well, first, even if successful, it doesn't get you to a Thomistic conception of essence or existence. Under pretty much any account of essence and existence, something's essence won't literally be numerically identical to its existence or the fact that it exists. But this kind of particular Thomistic conception is precisely what they would need, right? The epistemological argument only gets you to a mere non-identity between them. But as we've seen, the mere non-identity is utterly insufficient to establish the need for a concurrent causal dependence. Return, for instance, to the example of the spatial location, right? I mean, we can understand the essence of a cup without understanding that it's in any particular location, right? In which case, so the argument goes, its being in that location is distinct from its essence, but it doesn't thereby follow that it needs a kind of concurrent causal keeper that sustains it being in that position, and rather it doesn't require that, as we see with the astronauts on the International Space Station. And then just briefly, the second response is that I also just don't think that this argument is successful. I mean, for one thing, we're in an intentional context here. That's intention with an S, right? And in intentional contexts, those are essentially created by among other things, modality, so like modal contexts, like possibility and necessity, but also propositional attitudes. So when we say that we think that, or we believe that, or we wish that, or we understand that, things like that, or we grasp that, these are creating what's called an intentional context. Now, in intentional contexts, you cannot substitute co-referring expressions, that is to say expressions that refer to one and the same thing in experimental reality, you cannot swap those without potentially changing the truth value of the sentence as a whole, right? So for instance, Lois Lane might believe that Superman can fly, but she doesn't believe that Clark Kent can fly. Now this is actually, these both can be true precisely because, and even if Superman is identical to Clark Kent, these two can be true because we're in an intentional context. And so even though Clark Kent and Superman refer to one and the same numerically identical thing, she can still have different sort of doxastic attitudes and view them under different aspects or different descriptions or what have you, right? And so we can't infer the non-identity of Superman and Clark Kent from the mere fact that she can believe something about one and not the other. But similarly, it doesn't follow merely from the fact that we can understand something's essence without understanding whether or not it exists, right? It doesn't follow, the essence-existence distinction wouldn't follow from that. Again, precisely because we are in an intentional context, and hence we cannot infer the non-identity of these things merely from the fact that we grasp one without grasping the other. I mean, just think about, for instance, the morning star and the evening star. We might say that, oh, well, I can understand the essence of the morning star, or I can understand that the morning star exists without thereby understanding whether or not the evening star exists. But it doesn't thereby follow that the morning star is not identical to the evening star. In fact, they are identical. They're both a planet Venus, right? And the reason is because we're in an intentional context. Now, this is just a kind of critical thinking nerd tangent because, as I said, pretty much any account of essence and existence accepts that essence is not numerically identical with existence. But I did just want to say that, like, this argument is not a good argument. I think this is in my lights. And this is a good opportunity to think critically about intentional contexts and how they bear on different arguments, even in metaphysics and existential inertia. So then Gill went on to talk about the essence-existence distinction. So his premise one was that whatever has existence at any moment has it in virtue of its essence or in virtue of an external sustaining cause. Premise two, in contingent things in which essence and existence are distinct, existence cannot be had in virtue of its essence, and so all contingent things must have existence in virtue of an external sustaining cause. And he described this as a, quote, damning objection. And so, first of all, I don't think it's a damning objection, precisely because those three reasons that I was talking about with Christopher earlier, with Christopher's argument. It would only seem to be damning insofar as Plantinga's objection to the doctrine of divine simplicity is damning. Again, Plantinga's objection is not damning precisely because it's foisting upon the doctrine of divine simplicity a foreign metaphysical framework, and in this dialectical context, that's precisely what the inertialist is going to say in response to Gill. But also, even if successful, it's not an objection against the fundamental entitative thesis plus necessary existence, and so it doesn't target existential inertia as such. So, for instance, this is only saying that all contingent things must have existence in virtue of an external sustaining cause. Strictly speaking, as I've articulated in my other videos on existential inertia, that conclusion is compatible with existential inertia, because existential inertia says temporal concrete objects or some subset thereof persist in existence without requiring a sustaining cause, an external sustaining cause. And so that thing is compatible with there being a subset of temporal concrete objects, namely perhaps the fundamental ones that necessarily exist, not contingently exist, which sustain all the contingent things. So in and of itself, this isn't an objection to existential inertia. And then premise one, as I said, was false or at least question begging. So of course, it's partly the very question at issue as to whatever has existence at any moment has it in virtue of its essence or in virtue of an external sustaining cause. And so that just seems to be the very question at issue, right? I mean, it's precisely the thesis of existential inertia that this is not the case. So plausibly, premise one, in my estimation, is question begging, but also, even ignoring the question begging aspect of it, it seems to my mind to be a false dichotomy, again, because we have a whole host of alternative explanations of something in which essence and existence are distinct that don't adduce external sustaining causes. I was going over some of them in my response to Christopher. So Christopher, on the earlier account of existential inertia, he said that the earlier account in and of itself is not sufficient to establish existential inertia. And so in response, I think that doesn't get the dialectical context right? So I'm not aiming for these accounts to be able to establish existential inertia or even strictly entail it. Rather, I'm offering a kind of story or an account that the inertialist could use to fend off the objection that existential inertia is just a brute fact, right? And so these things aren't meant to be kind of things that establish existential inertia. Rather, the dialectical context is such that they're just plausible stories or accounts that the existential inertialist is offering that are saying, hey, this is how things might go. This is how things in reality might be. This is how existential inertia might be explained, if existential inertia is true. And also, I was primarily offering existential inertia as an undercutting defeater for the Aristotelian proof. And so what I was saying is that given that we accept transtemporal explanations, which I think we must accept, the question that arises in the dialectical context is, given that there are these transtemporal explanations, what further explanatory need is there for a concurrent sustaining actualizer? Given, of course, that there's a legitimate and simpler account of persistence, arguably, that we can have solely in terms of transtemporal explanation. And so it's a kind of undercutting defeater for the Aristotelian proof, not something intended to establish existential inertia. And so Christopher goes on to argue that the account still wouldn't fully or ultimately explain why O has existence at T, and there's the account on the screen there if you wanted to look at it. And so in some sense I agree, and in another sense I disagree. So in a sense I agree, right? Like, Thomism is compatible with transtemporal explanations, and I agree with him that it at least is an explanation. Whether or not it's a sufficient explanation or an adequate explanation is a separate question. But I agree with him that even under Thomism, transtemporal explanations are explanations, at least at some level, under Thomism, right? It's just that under Thomism, there is also going to be further explanatory work that's needed, namely a kind of sustaining cause of temporal objects at any moment at which they exist. So I agree with him in some sense that this account is at least partly open to the Thomist by saying that, present things are explained, at least in part, by transtemporal explanations from, for instance, past things. The Thomist is just going to say, that's not adequate. That's not fully adequate, rather. We also need a kind of sustaining concurrent ground of being. So in a sense, I agree with him there, right? For the Thomist, right, transtemporal explanations are not going to be enough by themselves. But in another sense, I disagree with Christopher, because I think, again, it goes back to the dialectical context. The inertialist's proposal here is that although the Thomist might think that it's inadequate, the inertialist is going to say, well, why is it inadequate? We can just say that given that we have these transtemporal explanations within our ontology, we could just say that, okay, well, then existential inertia obtains in virtue of these, right? That is what explains persistence, these transtemporal explanations. And so I think that it's really a dialectical point. The dialectical point is that we have this seemingly perfectly legitimate mode or model of explanation, and why can't we, right? Why can't we just apply that to the persistence in existence of things? And so while it is the case that under Thomism it's not an adequate explanation, I think the existential inertialist will just respond that, well, listen, under this other metaphysical account is treating it as an adequate or full explanation. And we would need some independent argument as to why that cannot be a full or adequate explanation. As far as I can tell, one of the main, at least, arguments that Christopher was giving was the one that I was addressing earlier for that very conclusion. And by my lights, I don't think that argument succeeds. One of Gill's criticisms was that Joe is not providing an ontology. So thankfully, Christopher rebutted this point, right? I mean, it's like a short article. I can't provide an entire ontology within the article. So Gill also said the existential inertia thesis is a description, and he's asking, in virtue of what is it persisting? He's saying that my account is a mere descriptive account. And I just have a question mark there, because this whole time I've been offering different ways by which we could plausibly explain it. Again, go back to my video, Existential Inertia, a User's Guide, for a variety of different explanations in virtue of which some things persist in existence, right? So one of them was, of course, the earlier account, which is just that there are these transtemporal explanations, and these transtemporal explanations, transtemporal just means across time, I guess I should say, or across times, and presumably or plausibly they're going to be immediately adjacent times. Another account would be the state maintenance account, where existence is treated as a kind of state of stasis or unchangingness. That one actually takes its cue from Feser's attempts to render the Aristotelian causal principle in the Aristotelian proof compatible with locational inertia, and it just applies what Feser says in response to that. It just applies it to existence. So that's the second way that we might explain it. A third way we might explain it is in terms of the metaphysical necessity of its obtaining. And so it's not just a description. I mean, the thesis is, but the different accounts that you can give of fleshing out the thesis and how it might obtain, those aren't merely descriptive. I said I was going to be brief, and I'm not being as brief as I wanted to, so I'm going to go very quickly here. It's not true that I'm just giving a just because answer, or inertialists are giving a just because answer. And inertialists do have a quote-unquote, like a metaphysical mechanism, as it were, or a means by which things persist, because as I was just articulating, I just articulated three, among others, right? Those aren't the only ones. But I was just articulating three potential ways that the inertialist might go with respect to providing a kind of means by which things persist, not just saying that they do persist without giving a kind of metaphysical account there. So I think this is also in terms of the earlier than account. He said that the explanation is true and legitimate on one level of explanation, but there's a deeper level of explanation. For example, depending for one's existence at all times on one's human nature. While Christopher did not claim it is, it nevertheless should be pointed out that this is not an efficient sustaining cause and hence does not target existential inertia. And again, I know Christopher wasn't claiming that it is an efficient cause. I'm just saying that this particular point wouldn't then target existential inertia as an objection. And then Gill said the earlier than account amounts to self-causation. So it's not self-causation because, again, these are trans-temporal causal explanations. So nothing is kind of pulling itself up by its own bootstraps or bringing itself into being. Rather, there are causal relations across times between the different quote-unquote stages, as it were, of objects. Though, as I note in my paper, it's not committed to stage theory or anything like that. So then Gill said existence must come from something external because of the essence-existence distinction. I think I've mainly already covered some of my responses to that, and this goes up to about the 1 hour 50-minute mark in their objections. I think I stopped at the 2-hour mark. I know that there are roughly 25 minutes left in it. I think that was how many. But, you know, I need to do midterms and all this other stuff. So just for the sake of time and me simply not having enough of it, I'm only going to cover the first approximately 2 hours of their discussion. And so that concludes my response, the part 1 and part 2, to their first 2 hours of their discussion. So I guess technically it wasn't a response to their entire video, but hey, 2 hours out of 2 hours and 25 minutes, that's good enough for a response. I need to study for midterms, so but I will give you a sneak preview of what's coming up on my channel. So Let's look at some upcoming videos and channel plans. So videos, these aren't necessarily in order, but I'm just really excited for these. So the first one, I think I'm going to do a video on what's called infinite pain. That is just, it's going to be a short lecture on just probably one paradox of infinity that I think is really cool, really fun, really interesting. You know, maybe it'll lend support to causal finitism, maybe not, we'll see. And then I also want to do two videos, Aquinas' first way and Aquinas' third way, an in-depth analysis on each. And then the fourth one, I emailed Gramapi and I'm like, hey, my dude, I'll let you pick like anyone in any philosophical field on any topic. Just pick one and then let's have a discussion with that person. So I sent that to him. He's still thinking about who he wants to have a discussion with, but. Because usually people tell Graham, like they tell him, like, hey, would you like to have a discussion with this person on this topic, right? So I want to have him choose whatever the hell he wants to talk about. So and then the fifth one is Dr. Tyrone Goldschmidt on ontological arguments. So he has a book actually forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. I think it's something like, the title is like Ontological Arguments or something. It's in the Elements series, the Cambridge Elements series. And then the sixth one is, does moral disagreement threaten moral realism? That's going to be a super exciting lecture. So much really good philosophy to do in that one. That one's probably going to have to come after Thanksgiving, though. And then the seventh one and eighth one, these both are maybes. I have not reached out to these people. So the seventh one is maybe I would like to have Dale Tuggy and Tim Paul discuss Trinitarianism on my channel. For those of you who don't know, Dale Tuggy is a Unitarian Christian, and he has done a lot of interesting and important work on different problems for Trinitarianism. And then Tim Paul is a very ardent and very able defender of sort of conciliar orthodox views of Trinitarianism and incarnation and things like that. And then another one that I want to have, which is, again, a maybe, is Alex Malpass and Rob Coons on causal finitism. And Alex said he's definitely interested in it, but we're kind of waiting on a journal to publish one of Alex's papers that is forthcoming before we go further on that one. And so channel plans, well, I don't know, like maybe I'll make a Patreon, I don't know. I mean, if so, I have some really exciting ideas, right? So like book giveaways or things like that, and access to like all the preparation that I do for a lot of my videos. Like a lot of these videos, for instance, with Ryan Mullins, like we'll make a discussion brief, right? And it'll be like 10 pages long, philosophy that kind of outlines what we were doing in the video and outlines different objections and different things that we were talking about. It's really good. And I want to give you guys access to that somehow. And so that would be something, and the Patreon could be like tiered or something, and I would make it super cheap. As you guys know, my book is super, super duper cheap. It's like, what, like $1.99 on the Kindle, and then like $5.99 or something like for the hardcover. So yeah, it would probably I'd probably make it max out at like, the highest tier would be like $10 a month or something, and then it would start at like 50 cents a month, and then $1 a month, and then $2 a month, like things like that. But yeah, there would be different rewards on some of them. I might do like book giveaways, or like send my book out and things like that. There would be differential access to the actual papers and scholarly work that I'm doing, and there'd be like behind the scenes access that you guys could get to different documents. All the documents that I've made thus far for preparing for videos, a lot of them are very, very in-depth and have some really, really good information. And yeah, so maybe I'll do that at some point. And thank you all for 1K subscribers. Y'all are the best. So that's wonderful. And then, as usual, pretty please like, subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications, and most importantly, share, right? Share with your friends. Spread the good news of Majesty of Reason. Anyway, hopefully this video serves you, and hopefully all those videos that I was laying out, hopefully those will be able to serve you as well. And, what more is there to say from now on out then? I'm Joe Schmidt, and this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.